Then we have Bob Bixby, who is Executive Director of the Concord Coalition. He is going to talk about the budget process, how it's supposed to work, and most importantly, how it actually does work, how that's changed over time, and what's some of the key terms and key moments that you should be paying attention to if you get drafted to do budget process stories at some point. We have Bob until 12:20, so he's going to present, and we have time for Q&A, and I'll turn it over to Bob. Welcome.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris. And pleasure to be with you all this morning. And sounds like you're going to be really steeped in budget issues by the end of the day. So this is a very good time to be talking about this because all of the aspects and foibles of the budget process are coming together all at once right now, this month. We have the pending shutdown of the federal government because so far appropriations bills haven't been passed. We have an impending default on the obligations because so far nothing has been done to raise or suspend the debt limit. And we have a looming reconciliation bill, which has all of the possibilities and quirks and hard feelings that come with reconciliation. And those are really key parts of the budget process that are all in play right now. As a federal budget, you're going to get some repetitive information today because some of my presentation, which I labeled federal budget process in context, has to do with the actual results of the federal budget that I'm sure you'll hear more about from Maya. But in order to put the federal budget process in context, it helps to see where things are. So this is where the federal budget was in 2019. It just stacks revenues against outlays and shows you where the big spending are and where we get the revenues from. The reason that this uses 2019 as the template is because things were so haywire in 2020 and 2021, they really don't make a good basis for comparison or a sort of a reasonable baseline of what the federal budget looks like. So 2019 was the last normal year, and that's about where we came out. Just for comparison, this is what we're expecting in 2021, or what CBO is expecting from their most recent budget and economic outlook. Still, obviously, I mean, is a very large deficit, but you can see the big change there is the so-called other mandatory spending, and that's related to the COVID relief. So a lot of budget analysis really still starts with 2019 right now if you're trying to make comparisons about where things are, unless you're doing very short-term analysis on the budget. One of the things that is relevant to the budget process, and that's is a trend in federal spending, is that more and more of the budget is on autopilot. The important distinction is between so-called discretionary spending and mandatory spending. So any analysis of the budget sort of begins with that. Discretionary spending is what goes through the annual appropriations process. That is where, if Congress hasn't passed the annual appropriations bills, the federal agencies need to shut down, which is what we're approaching now. But you can see, just as a matter of allocating between these categories, that discretionary spending is a shrinking part of the budget as more and more of the budget is taken up by mandatory spending programs, which are things that run on autopilot. Those are benefit programs like Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid. Those are the big three. Federal retirement programs fall into that category. And then there are a lot of smaller programs, TANF, SNAP, food stamps, or family support programs, agriculture supports. There are smaller things. But basically, it's the healthcare and the retirement programs that make up the mandatory spending. And then, of course, there's net interest on the debt, which has been larger as a percentage of the budget than it is now in this is really an interesting phenomenon also because you would think that with the large run up in debt, that interest cost on that debt would be rising substantially and taking up more of the budget than it is. But because interest rates have dropped to such low levels, the government has been able to take on much more debt and yet not have the interest costs go up as much. This is important just to look at the trend as far as the outcome of the budget is concerned. The debt was approaching record levels relative to the size of the economy before the pandemic hit. So I think a lot of people tend to think, we have $3 trillion of deficits that, once COVID is past us, the budget would return to normal. But it's important to know that we were already on a track of having very large budget deficits perpetually into the future before COVID hit. And that's true. This just shows, and I'm sure you get a lot more of this from Maya, but just to tee up that the long-term outlook does show the debt and deficits and debt getting to much higher levels in the next over the next 30 years. And the reason why is, and I think this is probably one of the more important charts. It may look a little technical, but basically all these things need to be viewed as a percentage of the economy, not in dollar terms. And when you look at outlays and revenues as a percentage of GDP, what this is showing is that revenues have tended to be about 17% of GDP and spending about 20% of GDP. And if the economy is growing at so that's a deficit of 3% of GDP. If the economy is growing around 3% in real terms, that's probably a sustainable trend. And people could argue about, whether we could do better or not. What is alarming about the budget that and I'm talking about again, pre-COVID, whatever happens this year out of the budget process. Going into it, there was this structural gap, imbalance between revenue and spending, where spending is on track to grow faster than revenue. And so instead of having built-in budget deficits around 3% of GDP, the trend is to have higher budget deficits, again, setting aside COVID, of 4 to 5% of GDP. And that's an area, that's uncharted territory. That's an area we haven't been in before. Is that going to cause problems? Is it not going to cause problems? I suspect we're going to find out, because we're certainly headed there, and there's nothing much to stand in the way right now. The things that are animating this are healthcare costs and the aging of the population and net interest costs. The long-term budget projections, certainly come down to that. The aging of the population alone means that programs like Social Security and Medicare, to an extent Medicaid, get more expensive. And that means that they will grow as a share of the economy. And if revenues stay about the same, then that's what's driving the budget deficit. The interesting thing is that, net interest eventually, this is a long-term chart. This is from CBO's long-term budget outlook. It really is net interest, even if you assume, as CBO does, that interest rates will remain lower, substantially lower than they have been historically. And the revenues, since we just looked at the spending side, revenues are projected to be relatively flat, staying around 17 to 18% of GDP. And that kind of sets up the structural imbalance and the debate about whether we should raise revenues as well as certainly if we're going to raise spending. One of the startling factoids really is that on autopilot on the CBO outlook, you could look at just the CBO's projections for the major healthcare programs, Social Security and net interest would consume all revenues by 2036. That's not a that's not a prediction. They're just saying, by the way, on autopilot, this is where we're headed, and it assumes no revenue increase. That's just the natural growth of revenues. And then the last slide I have just on the budget outlook is how difficult it is to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio. I think, people think it could be done with, a few cuts here and there, or raise some taxes here and there. Because of the structural imbalance and its projected growth and the way in which interest costs accumulate, even with low interest rates over time, it would really take some very aggressive action to stabilize the debt to GDP where we are now. But even if, and what this is showing, and again, this goes back to 2019, CBO hasn't updated this, but this is like where we were going into the pandemic, that this is the magnitude of the cuts that would have to be made each year to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio at the level that it was in 2019. And obviously, tax increases or spending cuts of this magnitude, or around 3% of GDP, are nowhere on the radar screen right now. So that's why I say that the normal parameters that we've been used to, deficits maybe around 3% of GDP, debt, under 100% of GDP, certainly. Those are going to be tested almost whether, there are things baked into the cake that are going to be very, very difficult. So I think that part of what goes on with the budget process this year is related to this underlying issue of, what do you do about this, the state of the budget outlook going into the budget process. And by the way, there's nothing in the budget process that compels anybody to do anything about that. That underlying process. It's at the moment anyway, it doesn't have any substantive goal or outcome. Sometimes there have been things like budget caps and deficit reduction plans and that sort of thing. But at the moment, the deficit reduction, the caps have expired, or they expire this year at the end of this year. So, there really isn't anything in the budget process related to deficit reduction as we used to think of in the past. Now the question is, how much new debt can we take on? How much should be paid for, and or not? And what's an investment and what isn't? And that's really a fundamentally different sort of question. So we're really at an inflection point, to use a phrase that gets overused in a lot of areas. But we really are, in the 30 years or so that I've been involved in federal budget issues, it's really a whole new concept. And we'll see where it ends up, but it's being tested right now. And that's why there's, a lot of friction around it. This is the formal budget process. As Chris alluded to at the beginning, it doesn't always get followed precisely. But the president kicks it off by submitting his budget. The president's budget is advisory. Congress doesn't need to consider it, and often they don't. But it does give the administration's priorities, and it's got a wealth of great information. if you're doing stories, the analytical perspectives and the historical tables are really, really quite helpful in terms of delving into specific issues. So they're well worth becoming familiar with. The Congress is supposed to complete action on a budget resolution in the middle of April. They never do. I think they may have met that deadline once. So ideally, what happens is the president submits his budget, the House and Senate budget committees have hearings on the president's budget, then they come up with their own respective budget plans. They go to the House floor, the Senate floor, coming out of the respective budget committees. They each pass their own budget resolution. They have a conference committee working out their differences between the House and Senate, and they adopt a congressional budget resolution, all of which is supposed to happen by April 15th. They usually don't even get started by that time. And sometimes they don't do a budget resolution at all. Yeah, so there are various workarounds. If they don't do a budget resolution, they can still start looking at the appropriations bills by May 15th. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but this shows a very aggressive timetable. If Congress is going to complete, if they're going to include a reconciliation bill in the budget resolution, they're supposed to complete that by the 15th of June. That's really what's happening now. And the whole process is supposed to be finished by June 30th. So that's an ambitious schedule. There's nothing about any of that that is enforceable. There's no there's no budget jail. You can't sue anybody for this. But the one thing that is enforceable is the last bullet, which is that no matter what has happened before, whether they've done a budget resolution or not, whether they've done reconciliation or not, by October 1st, they need to do something to pass funding for the next year's fiscal bills. The fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30th. So what's happening now is coming to the end of the fiscal year, no appropriations bills have been passed, and so you're facing a shutdown. Now, despite that, you know, the formal process of going through, really the things that matter are that appropriations deadline. You face a shutdown. The way they often deal with it, as they will this year, is to pass a CR, a continuing resolution, which just keeps things basically at the same level that they were for the prior fiscal year until they get things worked out. Usually congressional continuing resolutions have a fixed date on them. So I think we may see one coming up today that would extend funding through December 3rd or thereabouts. And then they would kick the can down the road until that point, until they can agree on full year spending bills, appropriations bills for fiscal year 2022. This has just been an increasingly frequent part of the budget process. I would say that it's almost become the regular order, is just to have regular appropriation bills not passed, and you wait until the end of the year, you pass a continuing resolution. What happens is it gives leadership an extraordinary amount of leadership, kind of bleeds power away from the appropriations committees. And that's been a real shift in congressional dynamics. And I don't see that abating anytime soon. The other thing that's really, really important is reconciliation. Some people have argued that that's the only reason there even still is a budget process and an attempt to do a budget resolution. Budget reconciliation, which I can talk about a little bit more, but it's really the purpose is to get around the Senate filibuster, so that any senator can block a bill, and you have to have 60 votes to waive that filibuster. Reconciliation is a budget process that gets around that, but it's only authorized if you do a budget resolution. You must have a budget resolution. So that is the main motivation these days for doing budget resolutions. If the party in power wants to do something big and get around the Senate filibuster, they will sometimes pass almost a shell of a budget resolution. They don't really care much what's in it so long as they have reconciliation instructions. The trade-off with using reconciliation is very, very important, is that it has limitations because the minority party usually has a lot of power to block things in the Senate. To limit that traditional authority, when reconciliation was devised, limitations were put on it, so you can't just do anything you want in reconciliation. And we got a good look at that last night when the Senate parliamentarian ruled that one of the things that the Democrats want to do this year in terms of immigration was not appropriate to do in reconciliation for reasons that I can talk about later. And then the final thing here is the debt limit. The debt limit is not part of the budget process, but it obviously interacts with the budget process. The debt limit is an absurdity, quite frankly. It was originally passed to facilitate government borrowing at the end of, at the beginning of World War I. It's morphed into something quite different. It is a hard dollar cap on the debt of the United States, and it really has no economic or budgetary meaning. What it says is it doesn't affect spending or revenues. In other words, it doesn't affect the policies that produce the debt. What it says is the Treasury cannot issue new debt, can't borrow to pay the bills that have already been incurred. So I've come to view the debt limit as doing potentially more harm than it does good, because it isn't a check on fiscal policy. It doesn't prevent, because once the bills have been incurred, you have to pay them. So the big difference between a shutdown and a default, and there is a big difference, is the shutdown says the government, because the appropriations bills haven't been passed, does not have the authority to incur obligations. That's why they send government workers home. We can't pay you because the appropriation has run out. We have no authority to commit resources, and so don't even show up. What the debt limit does is say we can't issue debt to pay the obligations that we've already incurred. So it's a different sort of a thing. I'm not sure the government would actually have to shut down in a debt limit situation, because it's really just affecting Treasury's ability to borrow, and it doesn't affect the ability to incur new obligations, which is why it doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. But anyway, they're two very different things. The debt limit is not part of the budget process. Obviously, it's very important. I do want to leave some time for questions, so I'll kind of run through the charts on the budget. But I mentioned the budget resolution.
And Bob, just an FYI, the fellows will get the slide deck from you. So all these points that you're making on these later slides, if you don't have time for them, they'll get them.
Yeah, I'll kind of run through the highlights here, and then you can go through. But it is, the budget resolution is important for setting spending, revenue, deficit, and debt levels, and for giving spending allocations to the Appropriations Committee. These are the levels that can be enforced during the year by points of order. It's not a law. Sometimes budget resolutions, people talk about what their aspirations are for the budget resolution, but it doesn't change policies. It just is about numbers. And of course, it doesn't require the president's signature. It's a blueprint for Congress and it can't be filibustered in the Senate. And the most important thing, no budget resolution, no reconciliation. There are 12 annual appropriation bills, and those are the things that must be signed. Now, if 3 or 4 of them are signed, those agencies are okay. They don't shut down. It's only the ones that don't have their appropriations bills passed. And the reconciliation, is a process. It's also a type of bill. And the important thing to remember about the reconciliation bill is the limitations under the so-called Byrd rule. There are only certain things you can do. That it must be specifically related to budget outcomes, like earlier in this year when the Democrats were not able to get through a hike in the minimum wage, and this year when they were not able to look at the immigration bill. By the way, the parliamentarians' rulings are not binding. They can be overridden. So it could be that the Democrats would want to attempt to overrule the parliamentarian. Generally speaking, that does not happen. They generally don't like to do that. Couple of things, just while we're on the debt limit and the budget process. One of the things that's being debated now is whether there should be a direct raising of the debt limit or a suspension of the debt limit. They have been suspending the debt limit since 2013 at various points. One of the reasons that the Democrats have not up till now put a debt limit reconciliation instructions, which they can do. The debt limit can be raised through reconciliation, but it can't be suspended through reconciliation. Nobody thought of suspending the debt limit when the budget process was put together. So if the Democrats had gone with or do go with a reconciliation bill, put a debt limit increase in the reconciliation bill, and this gets into the politics of it, they'd have to put in a specific number, which of course the Republicans could then use in campaign ads. So they would rather do it through suspending the debt limit, but they can only do that through regular order. How that's going to come up, I don't know. But it would be grossly irresponsible to default. You're talking about the creditworthiness of the United States, not just a shutdown. A default would be much, much worse than a government shutdown. I will close with one of my favorite quotes from a former director of the Congressional Budget Office who was asked about problems with the budget process and how that could help with the overall budget outcomes. And Rudy Penner famously said, the problem is not the process. The problem is the problem. And right now, Congress is certainly confronted with the problem. So let me stop with that and race through a lot of stuff there and see if you have any questions.
Okay, if anybody has a question, just raise your hands. Caroline, Simon, turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you so much for doing this. I'm Caroline. I work for CQ Roll Call covering immigration. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of the implications of the fact that Congress seems pretty unable to pass major policy through any avenue other than appropriations bills or reconciliation bills. They're not very good at passing just kind of plain policy bills. What impact does that have in your view?
Well, it really it makes for dysfunctional policy. If your appropriations process is reduced to nothing but continuing resolutions and shutdowns and developed by leadership, it really takes away the individual members' ability to have an input. And I've talked to a lot of individual members who are very frustrated by that because they run for Congress, they've got ideas, they want to do things, and they feel like they're shut out. And now even committee chairmen, who used to be referred to as cardinals, all powerful committee chairman and subcommittee chairman of appropriations committees, it really diminishes their power. And I think it really stifles any sort of bipartisan policymaking. Now, we did have kind of an exception with the bipartisan infrastructure bill this year, but that was really outside the normal process. That wasn't a committees go through and pass their respective bills and whatever. That was kind of a rump group of people in the Senate that got together and did their own thing. And then eventually the leadership came on board. And that might be the new model. I mean, you might just see groups forming themselves into ad hoc groups and putting together, bills like that. So I think that's an interesting model to watch. On the things like immigration and more bigger policy issues, I really despair at this point, because if the only way you can get things done is through reconciliation, and reconciliation limits what you can do, it means that very large things like immigration reform or voting rights, as they're talking about, even climate change, is like climate standards that I think are going to face a tough test in passing the bird rule legislation. It just makes it increasingly difficult with the breakdown in the process to get any big things done.
Thank you.
And by the way, if everything on autopilot is in tough shape, whether it's the budget outcomes or it's things that you care about in a policy sense, that's a problem.
Bob, I was wondering if you could give the reporters here a sense of who the other people are in town from the right to the left who you consider good, reputable experts to go to, and place yourself among the spectrum. I mean, who are some of the budget experts who you have professional respect for, even though you don't agree with them? I mean, who are some of the other folks that might be good for these fellows to know about?
Well, that's interesting. I have a podcast called Facing the Future. It's a Concord Coalition thing. And I have those guests on regularly, and we talk about these things. So, certainly you're going to be hearing from one of them. Maya McGinnis is certainly somebody I've known and worked with for a long time. And she is certainly one. I would say, a couple of budget veterans who have been around for a long time that are worth checking in with on these things are Bill Hoagland at the Bipartisan Policy Center. He was for many years a Republican. I mean, he still is a Republican as far as I know, but he was staff director at the Senate Budget Committee for a long time, and then worked as appropriations advisor to the Senate Majority Leader on the Republican side. A fellow named Joe Minerick is a Democrat from the Committee for Economic Development. He's a vice president there. He was the chief economist for the Clinton administration at OMB for all 8 years of the administration. I work a lot and have over the years with Joe and Bill, because I think that they are capable of operating in an intellectually honest, bipartisan way. So I think that those are a couple of good sources. And those institutions, I mean, I think that the Bipartisan Policy Center and the Committee for Economic Development are good. Look, people that I don't always agree with, I think that one of them's in the administration. Jared Bernstein is, I would say, less concerned about long-term budget deficits, but he's not a deficits don't matter guy. But I've always found him to be very good to work with and having the show. Brian Riedel is a very conservative guy from the Hudson Institute. I think is good to check in with. Wendy Edelberg at Brookings.
Okay.
Progressive Policy Institute is another place. Will Marshall and Ben Ritz. There's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of people that you can check in with. I would say, really, CBO and the GAO, Government Accountability Office, really put out some great stuff.
Okay. Orion.
Thanks. And thanks, Bob, for doing this. I'm Orion Donovan Smith with the Spokesman Review in Spokane. Cover everything federal government for them. And I don't know how much you want to speak to the reconciliation kind of being the new normal. And I just wondered, particularly what we just saw with the parliamentarians ruling on immigration, how much we're headed in the direction of this just being, the main way, or one of the main ways big legislation gets done. And, is that going to just keep intensifying, or are we going to hit a point where you see this changing?
In the long arc of the years that I've worked on these issues, it has intensified greatly. I mean, I thought things were, that there was a partisan, highly partisan charged atmosphere in 1992. And in those days, people spoke to each other anyway, and considered each other's ideas, so I hate to say it, but I do see an intensification, and there'll be a blow up at some point. The filibuster will be gone, or reconciliation will be gone, or something. There'll be a default on the debt, and there'll be some hiccup, I think, that might. But there are larger sources at play in the society in general that are contributing to this, whether it's social media or everybody living in their own silos. But let me say something about reconciliation. One of the byproducts, and this goes back to an earlier question as well, is that it can produce quirky legislation because it has to fit within certain parameters. What they will do, they've done it before, they'll do it this year, is they'll do things like sunset policies and pretend that they go away because they want to fit it within a narrow budget window. So they've approved 3.5 trillion of spending. If you want to fit, or let's say you want to shrink it to a mansion size level, with an official score that's 1.5, but it still gives you about 3.5 worth of policies. You just sunset stuff. So, or you phase it in so it doesn't come in until the end. And you're seeing that now, that the extension of the child tax credit looks like they're only going to extend it for a few years. Well, of course, everybody knows that they're going to extend that. So it's really a gimmick. It's a scoring gimmick. Things like dental coverage for Medicare might be phased out to the end of the program, so it doesn't have a cost in the early part of the program. Right now, from the tax bill that the Republicans passed in 2017, we have provisions expiring at the end of 2025. Well, nobody thinks they're going to actually expire. Congress will probably act to extend those. So what you get is lumpy legislation that creates problems down the road. Several years ago, we had the fiscal cliff that the Bush tax cuts all expired at once, which was an absurd assumption. So what we're all going to be doing, if you cover the budget, certainly we will be doing it at Concord, and people who cover the budget are going to be doing it, is going through the reconciliation bill to see where the gimmicks are. What sunsets, what phases in, what unrealistic expectations are there. And that's not a good way to do legislation. It's not transparent at all.
Okay, any other questions? I have one very quick question. This is a very, very specific one, Bob. But in your tables, you had the slide about healthcare inflation, the aging of America, net interest costs drive spending, and showing the bars about the change in outlays as a percent of GDP between now and 2051. I was surprised that Social Security was relatively low at 1.4%. Is that assuming benefits aren't going up at all?
No, it assumes current law and it assumes that benefits will continue to be paid even after the trust fund. I didn't even talk about the trust funds.
Right.
They're not, but it does make that assumption, which technically can't happen. They'll have to pass some legislation. But yeah, no, Social Security, you know, it does rise as a percentage of GDP, just not as aggressively as do the healthcare programs. What that chart is showing you, if we lumped Medicaid and the ACA subsidies along with Medicare and called it healthcare, it would be even more dramatic. So that's why there's a lot of attention on healthcare cost growth. That because Medicare, Social Security is, you know, you reach a certain level when the boomers retire, where the program kind of levels out in terms of, it doesn't start to shrink. A lot of people think, oh, it'll start to shrink when the boomers retire, but it does because there's you know, people are living longer. But it's not, you know, when we get to the end of in the 2030s or so, the growth more or less, the big spurt, you're done with the boomers, the effect of the boomers retirement. So what we're seeing there is that, you know, Medicare and healthcare in general is a much greater problem than is Social Security. Social Security has always been the easier problem to fix. It's just politically, what they say, the third rail of American politics. So we're going to see what happens in that regard.